Robert, I'm going to have to lean back from the screen. I'm going to have to keep my own composure because I can't even imagine how the players feel right now.
Well, Magnus Carlsen, he has got those arms crossed. Hikaru, he's dressed sharply for the occasion. And here we go. Nakamura with the white pieces in game one. We see him use the king's pawn. No bong clouds today. I don't think we're going to see that. We get knight f3, knight c6, and a Spanish, Tanya.
A Spanish, both of these players, we expect them to bring their A game from the very first moves. No 1a3, no 1g4 from Hikaru Nakamura. He is taking this seriously. And Magnus, repeating what he played against MVL, clearly indicating that he wants to play a Marshall, and he does.
We get that Marshall, and it's c6 this time. So Magnus Carlsen, he is kind of mixing it up here, causing some problems for Hikaru, you would think, except for the fact that Hikaru is playing instantly. He is well prepared.
And Magnus has played the Marshall before. C6 is the main move. Against MVL, Carlsen was playing the sideline, bishop b7. That has surprise value. This has the reputation. And notice Hikaru putting his pawn on d3. Robert, this line got very popular about 10 years ago. I think Vichy Anand was the first to popularize it at the highest level. Generally, it's considered a risk-free way to fight for a small advantage. And often, white actually ends up giving up the extra pawn.
And look at this move, queen h4, the bishop on f5 was under attack, but h2 was a checkmate threat. So that's why the pawn went to g3 to blunt the bishop on d6. Now the queen slides up into the compromised light squares, protecting the bishop on f5. And if that bishop can join the queen in the kingside party, there could be a checkmate against the white king.
Oh, absolutely. That's why the Marshall was invented. Frank James Marshall was one of the greatest attacking players of the late 19th, early 20th century. And nowadays, the Marshall is often used as an equalizing weapon. Engines have breathed new life into this line. And what you often see white doing here is quickly bringing this knight up to e4. Robert, white has to start developing his queenside, or there will be hell to pay on the e-file.
And he does bring his knight to d2, but look at this. Black is taking advantage of the fact that white lacks development. The move f5 is played. The rook on e1 is loose, but the bishop on d6 is also loose. But you take a bishop, you lose a rook. That might not be a good trade. And wow, what a concept here. Sacrificing a piece to win it.
Whoa, look at this. Oh, they're following. I had a game just like this against Ding in the Pro Chess League 2 years ago. I remember this move.
Bishop f3 check catches a card by surprise. He looks upset right now. And the point is after the king is dragged to the f3 square, rook takes f4 is check. You win one pawn, and then you're going to win the pawn on e4 next by force. And remember, just because the knight is pinned, it still protects that rook on f4. You can't play king takes rook. The knight covers the square.
P. Pinned pieces protect. You cannot take the rook. The rook takes the pawn. Material equality has been restored. And I hesitate to use the words dead draw because both of these players, Robert, they are known for their ability to squeeze a win out of the most unlikely types of endgames. They can win rook versus rook. Hikaru has won a lot of rook versus rook endgames throughout his career. But with the 1 second increment and plenty of time on their clocks, I think this first game is likely to end in peace. Now, is Hikaru the one actually fighting for the edge here as he prepares c4?
Some people like the rapper Hoodie Allen. Others might like Hoodie Carlsen over here. He has his hood up over his head. He wants to be the Grim Reaper. Right now, it's even material. You're talking about the move c4, but let's talk about the king side. Black has a healthier pawn structure on g7 and h7. So it's clear what Hikaru's intentions are. He wants to push that pawn, go after the targets on the queen side. And I have to say that if white isn't careful, if the game is prolonged, I feel like the knight being able to hop from color complex to color complex can be very dangerous in this position.
That's a fantastic point. The bishop obviously has to stay on its initial color, and the knight with every move switches to a different color. And speaking of switching to a different color, the knight hops back to e7 and then forward again to f5. And I think the point of this move is to keep the integrity of black's queenside pawn structure alive. If c takes b5, black can actually take either way, but I like a takes b5 to keep the c-file shut.
I like the look of that as well. The knight on e7 is doing an important duty. And this king went to f8, right? It's out of the bishop's path. The king can keep marching towards the center. King e8, king to d7. And the white king at some point would probably want to go the f3 square, but the rook can even go over to h4, putting pressure on that isolated pawn on h2. So I feel like for Hikaru, he doesn't really have something to threaten just yet. And because black's pawn structure is healthier and Magnus is a healthy minute and a half up on the clock, I prefer his chances.
I agree, and Hikaru should, I think, take the first opportunity to repeat moves if he can make that happen. There is a repetition with king f3, rook h4, and then king back to g3, but black does not have to oblige. He can jump into f5 with check and simultaneously defend the rook. So with every ticking second, the likelihood that Magnus starts playing with this for a win, Robert, I'm totally on the same page, increases.
Yes,
There it is.
I'm so there. King goes after rook h4. If king g3, knight f5 check, it starts to feel like black is gaining some of the momentum in the position. So Hikaru cannot just make a draw here. And I want to give a shout out to the over 65,000 people watching this match. This is the clash of the titans. It's Hikaru Nakamura and Magnus Carlsen. And you do not want to miss the rest of it. I'm so glad we're just getting started. And the rook is just getting started. That is a checkmate threat. The bishop covers f7. The knight probably has to jump out the way. But Danya, the knight on e7 is doing an important duty. It's protecting the c6 pawn. So the knight jumps to, say, g6. Maybe the white rook will slide into the d6 square at some point. Or even to d7, but not yet because of the fork on e5. So knights being tricky pieces, you have to watch out for checks and forks.
Took the words right out of my mouth. You don't want to miss the rest of this match. You also don't want to miss a checkmate in game 1 of the SEC final. And something tells me Magnus sees the threat. He's thinking about how to parry it. There are alternatives. You could slide the king over to e8. You could push a pawn to g6 and create some luft on g7, but that allows the rook to run amok with rook d8 check and then back to d7. Carlsen does entrench his knight on f5. And will Hikaru now try to infiltrate the 7th rank and threaten rook f7 check? Robert, what do you think is the most clinical way here to secure the draw?
Well, look at Magnus. I mean, he just got up in his chair there. He is ready to pounce. And the reason why is rook d7 looks threatening because that check on f7, black simply slides the pawn up to g6. It's very important to note the rook on h4 is not just an attacking piece. It is protecting that vulnerable pawn on h7. Point. So rook d7, it threatens to win a piece. You can just protect that piece, keep your pawn safe and sound. Now the c6 pawn, that's the target you want to have. And let's talk about something long-term, Danya. We should not forget to mention that if white can play pawn b3 and pawn a4, there is some potential for an outside pass pawn as this game continues. So that's what Magnus needs to keep an eye on.
That's a great point. And what you're showing is that this is still a 3-result game. It's not like black has target practice here. Magnus has to keep that in mind. Bishop c2 by Nakamura. No, he is not blundering a fork on d4 because the king will slide over to g3 and Magnus will have to spend a tempo as he just did to defend the rook. The bishop is going to move away from c2. You can also protect it with rook d2. You can just sense that Magnus has the initiative. He's calling the shots. But for the time being, Robert, there's basically nothing to attack. That king on g3 is perfectly situated from a defensive point of view.
And at some point, you have to be on the lookout for bishop takes h7. Because the rook on h4
like now
gets distracted. What's wrong with it?
Nothing. It wins a pawn. And it forces Magnus to enter the defensive.
Right. If the rook takes... And they both miss it. They both completely missed that option. I mean,
oh my gosh.
That was a pawn that, if captured, distracts the rook away from the defense of the knight. So I'm a little confused what the players are seeing. Maybe we are missing something, but I don't think so. I think that was just a hanging pawn.
I don't think so, Robert. I think this is pre-match jitters. The match has just started. Listen, these players... Hikaru's noticed it. Yep, you can just tell in the body language, how could I have missed bishop takes h7? A little bit of jitters here to start the match from both players.
And Magnus Carlsen's talking to himself. He's like, where do I get these winning chances from? I'm up a minute on the clock. I'm better. c5 looks like a great move. He takes the bishop, which is surprising.
I like it.
But objectively, it might be best. Look at the evaluation bar. Better for black. What's his idea? King activity. In the end game, the king is a weapon. It's an aggressive piece. He doesn't go up. Why not?
King d5 and rook d4, and the pawn endgame is winning due to the massive disparity in king activity. Now, Robert, you pointed out that white could create a pass around the queen side. Well, black can do the same thing on the other side. Imagine if the rooks are off the board. c5, c4, and then b4, c3. That's a lot of pawn moves, but white is nowhere near creating a pass pawn either. So I think Magnus should go for the win here, but he's black. It's game 1. Maybe he wants to play with an abundance of caution, and I'm kind of surprised.
Yeah, it doesn't really seem like the Magnus we're used to, where he just beats everybody no matter the position. But I think it's a fine choice. He's like, I'm only slightly better. I get the white pieces now, and I think he believes that with the first move advantage, he could take down Hikaru.
And a King's Indian from Hikaru Nakamura in game 2. If you're familiar with Hikaru's career, you would not be surprised at that choice. At some point, Hikaru was playing the King's Indian almost exclusively. He scored countless brilliant victories in over-the-board chess. And the big surprise, Robert, is not the opening choice. It's what Magnus has just played, bishop to d3, rather than the typical bishop e2. What do you make of this?
And it's the small things that make the biggest difference at the highest level. Look at that. Bishop d3, dragging the bishop out to g4, and then bishop e2. That looks like a loss of a tempo. But what is gained? That light square bishop is so important in the King's Indian. If the bishop takes the knight on f3, you're not going to get your typical attack when you eventually move your knight away from f6, push your pawn to f5, and storm on the king side. So black does not want to capture this knight on f3. So Magnus does what Magnus does best. He kind of lures his opponent into an unknown position, that deep, dark forest that Mikhail Tal liked to talk about. And he said there's only room out for one of us.
And Leela, that's a great quote. One of my favorites. Leela and Stockfish, they have breathed new life from the white side of the King's Indian. I have to begrudgingly admit, as a biased King's Indian player myself, but they have found so many new variations, obscure lines that seem to give white a small but stable advantage. And you can see Magnus dropping his knight away, forcing the exchange of light-squared bishops. And that doesn't mean, Robert, that Hikaru is not going to try to go f5. It's just going to be a lot harder to infiltrate down the light squares with the bishop now absent from the board.
It's just a lot less scary, right? Because f5 can always be met by f3. And one of the big features of the King's Indian defense is that dark squared bishop for black is bad. I'm sorry to say it, Danya. I know this is your beloved opening. I say it out of the finals here. Respect and love, but that bishop on g7 is one only a mother could love because it's stuck behind a pawn on e5. That is why sometimes you want a pawn break. It opens the board up. And look at this move, g4. You want to play f5? I dare you. Come at me, because GF, then it will open the G file, and that bad bishop on G7 I was just talking about will get in some big trouble.
And I'm almost positive Hikaru is going to switch his attention to the other side of the board. Let's bring up our first analysis board of the day. I'll show you what can happen if you play f5. This is unthinkable. You never play f5 if it allows the G file to open. White can simply take twice. And we're not talking about the positional concessions black makes, giving up this massive e4 square for white's knights. Look at the G file. Rook G1. Let's say black plays a random move, and you can already resign after rook takes g7 and queen g4 with the knight sinking its teeth into e4 on the next move. Robert, Hikaru didn't even take a second to think about f5, and as predicted, he situates his knight on c5 instead.
Yeah, it's why we study our openings, right? Hikaru Nakamura hasn't memorized this position, but he has a great fundamental understanding that f5 is too dangerous. Now, he might need to play that move just to get some semblance of activity, because what can you do on the other side of the board? You would like to push your pawn a5 back to a6 and play the move b7 to b5, but you can't do that. Pawns don't go backwards in chess, unfortunately. How else do you crack open that side of the board? Maybe c6, but c6 comes at a cost. The d6 pawn will be a long-term weakness. You're still not getting the move b5 in, so white has a free hand on the king side, Danya, where black has absolutely nothing to show for on the queen side.
And black needs to get down to business to defeat the Huns here, because if he doesn't, the attack is coming at a furious pace. Magnus is about to play h5 and open up the h-file, and you basically have, if you're Hikaru, 3 or 4 tempi maximum to create some intrigue on the other side of the board. You can see Hikaru desperately trying, but Magnus, he calmly brings his knight to b1. Why is he doing that? Why is he contorting himself like that? It's to stop b7, b5, which is one of the only options that black has to open up the queen side, and the knight on c3 is integral in stopping that advance from happening.
You know, contortionists usually freak me out. It scares me what they do with their bodies, but I'm loving the way that white is maneuvering those knights. The knight back to b1. Wesley So did this against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. We talked about it a lot. He knows where to put his pieces. The knight is best placed on c3 here. And now, again, white has nothing to fear on the queen side. King b1 looks like a generally useful move, just in case black has any ideas of opening up the queen side. And you're just pointing this out. Black now closes the king side, and look at the Petrosian king march. That king is going away from the queen side to e1, to f1, to g2, where it will just sit safely on the king side. And then when white is ready to strike, will Magnus try to push pawns on the queen side.
And I think the real reason he's marching his king, as you point out, is to go from defending to attacking on the queen side. But it's also to liberate this knight. Where does the knight really belong? Where the knight is eyeing this beautiful f5 square, where it's going to lord over the entire king side. Well, you couldn't do that easily with your king on the queen side because of b7, b5. And Hikaru is reminding Magnus of what is going to happen the moment he moves his knight away from c3. But Robert, I just want to point out, h6 by Hikaru was a necessary move. That was a really, really strong idea that freezes the king side and gives Hikaru the time he needs to set things up on the other side of the board. The engine might give +2 here, but it's actually incredibly hard to make progress even though you're positionally dominating.
You're going to use that word fortress. Magnus Carlsen of years past may not believe in it, but Hikaru Nakamura certainly does. And the reason why, how can you make progress? You need a pawn break. Where's the pawn break going to come from? You can never play the move f2 to f4 because black has both of the pawns staring there. And similarly, black can never play f7 to f5 for the same reason. So the king side remains completely locked. What about the queen side? Maybe an eventual pawn a3, pawn b4, but that seems forever away, especially because black is ready to meet that. And he plays a4.
There we go.
If you play a3, you'll never play b4. If you play pawn b2 to b3, thank you for opening up the queen side. My rook on a8 is developed in its starting home, and then knight moves out the way, and there will be some activity.
And Magnus has to be a little bit careful because 2 can play at that game. He strikes first with b4. He waited until the precise moment that Hikaru was ready to play b5. This is White's last opportunity to push the b-pawn, and he does. I love that decision from Carlsen. Robert, I think if Hikaru could squeeze b5 in, we could soon start having a completely different conversation. With the king side locked up, it might very well have been black who would have held all the cards on the queen side. As it stands, Magnus will get a rook to b3 in the event of an en passant. And then b5 will once again be virtually unachievable, especially if a pawn lands on a4.
This is getting very bad for Hikaru. So he plays the move b6. I think it's a very smart play. He wants to keep the position as locked as possible. If the move b5 is played by white here, the knight goes back to c7. And then the question becomes where to make progress. There are no pawn breaks. The issue for black is this pawn on a4. It sticks out. And that's why the move a3 was played, both to defend the b4 pawn. At some point, as you're highlighting, the queen is going to come to c2. That pawn may go from b4 to b5, and the a4 pawn may collapse. So that's the thing that needs to be looked out for. However, Tanya, we should not forget the g4 pawn. You beat me to it. You know where my mind's going, that the queen on e2 is doing an important task.
And we know where Magnus's mind is going, and we know where his king is going. It's going to defend the g4 pawn to free up the queen so that it can move to c2 and attack the a4 pawn. And Robert, engines are still very bad in these types of positions. Stockfish was myopically suggesting the move b5 leading to a totally locked positions. Engines don't always understand the concept of not being able to make progress. Magnus, of course, is going to keep his pawn on b4 in order to open up the possibility of reopening the queen side at his convenience. Hikaru is in dire straits here.
He certainly is, but our viewership is sky high through the roof. Over 100,000 viewers across YouTube, Twitch, and all the platforms. Thank you so much. We are just getting started. The fun is just beginning. And the fun may be getting started for Magnus Carlsen because it's right now, it's tied, a draw in the first game. And after a takes b4 here, black is sitting very passively. The pawn on a4 will be captured, I believe, right now. But if knight takes a4, Danya, there may be the response b6 to b5. Yep. C4 pawn is pinned to the queen over there on c2.
There's an incredible idea that involves taking on a4 and then actually sacking the knight, driving the c pawn up to c6 and banking on the protected and connected passers. But we'll cross that bridge if we get there. Magnus, he needs to defend the c4 pawn. Robert, I have been very impressed with Hikaru's defense here in the early going. He is challenging Magnus. He is posing problems, and he's trying to get this into a time scramble.
Right, and b5 played by Magnus. Saying your knight, if it goes to b8, it's trapped there. It's not getting out anytime soon. But if it goes up to c5, then white can take on c5. And I actually think this is quite ingenious in many ways. The a4 pawn is dropping, but even if it weren't, Danya, that knight on c3, we like to think of dream squares. The knight might land on f5, and guess what? Or c6, as you're pointing out.
C6.
And yeah, light squares, dark square bishop. Good luck parrying off that threat. It is going to be very unpleasant.
You got Bali on f5. You got Hawaii on c6. That knight has prospects. And right now, Magnus needs to get rid of Hikaru's knight on c5, take the pawn on a4. And Magnus, well, he's got to make sure that he keeps the c4 pawn defended. This might be the only tender spot in White's entire position. Most importantly here, White is really in no hurry. Magnus could take his time to get this knight around, again, either to f5. c6, I think, is a little bit more accessible, although it's not too hard to get to f5 either. As long as you defend this pawn, which he just did, you could start the maneuvering process right about now. But Hikaru, he prepares to grab control of the a file, which may be his only asset at this point.
Well, there's a dual threat. The a file and rook takes b5 was a threat because the queen was loose on c2. So if white makes a move, let's say we're at a free turn with knight d1, immediately rook takes b5 is available because the c4 pawn is pinned to the white queen. But the queen moved to e7. It wants to go to f6 and up to f4, causing that white king some problems. But Danya, I think it's just scary looking, but not scary in principle. And Magnus down to 18 seconds. He's got to find a way out.
Listen, scary looking things actually become scary when you've got 10 seconds on your clock. The enemies become magnified, and Hikaru is second to none at twisting you into a knot, even if you're completely winning when you're down to those last seconds. Rook to A3 pins the knight, and suddenly Black getting really active here. Queen F4 coming next.
Rook B3, you lose the C4 pawn. We swap rooks, the C4 drops.
Queen F4.
He goes backwards. Queen F4 is a huge move, and Black suddenly has the upper hand, but he goes Rook 8. That was a big missed opportunity for Hikaru Nakamura.
Queen F4 forced the favorable queen trade because the e-pawn would have captured, opening up a pathway for the Black bishop. But we've moved on from that. This is still a game, and Magnus is very close to getting his knight to that promised land on F5, and he does.
Oh, this is terrible for Black because now you're just getting squished. You have no space for your pieces. And don't be surprised if White makes the move C4 to C5 at some point, a la Vasil Ivanchuk, Garry Kasparov. It's a clearance move. You get a pass pawn. So look for that option at some point for White.
But Magnus, he's dilly-dallying. He's trying to build some time up on his clock. It's time for C5. I think it's his only break. He has no other way to make progress.
He can play the move. I understand he might be a little bit nervous about it. He's just trying to keep consistent on the clock, moving his rook back with Queen E3 again. Now C5
repetition is on the cards.
Strong.
And he's got to be careful to avoid 3-time repetition.
I think he'll be okay with it. I think he sees the position as being locked up. He just wants to escape without losing. Ooh, rook B3 to C4 pawn's a little bit loose, but not actually capturable.
And I don't know, with 2 seconds, is he going to decide on C5? He decides to exchange rooks, but he gives up the pawn. Oh my gosh. And he's given up another one.
I think it's just a draw. Queen E1, and we have a draw by repetition.
Oh my lands, and Magnus doesn't decide on C5. It was difficult to calculate the ramifications, especially against Hikaru. It's a draw by perpetual check.
Ooh, now both players can breathe a sigh of relief there because Hikaru was worse, but he also had a shot with Queen F4, and Magnus down in time trouble saying, my mouse speed is there. I can hang with Hikaru Nakamura, and it's not just a hoodie hanging on my head. So we see that it's 1-1, great defense from both, and we are just getting started. Done. Still 68.5 minutes remaining in the longest time control.
Neither of the players able to land a punch in the first 2 games. Magnus came so close in that game. It was an exquisite positional effort. He outplayed Hikaru in his pet King's Indian. But at the end of the day, Robert, if you think about Hikaru's greatest strength, what does he have to harness in order to try to knock the world champion out of the SCC and claim the title for himself? It's his time scrambling ability. I think that is Hikaru's biggest objective edge over Magnus. When Hikaru is in top form, his time scrambling is unbelievable.
Yeah, it's really tough to match up with Magnus Carlsen, but Hikaru Nakamura proving he's capable of doing just that. We are in our 3rd game of the match. We see that we had a Queen's Gambit accepted. So what's the dynamic right now? White has an extra pawn in the center, E3 and D4 versus just a single pawn E6. White is castled. The Black King is in the center. But what does Black have going for him? No actual targets, no weaknesses in the position. Well, Danya, Magnus is thinking. He's spending a lot of time here. Is he unfamiliar with this setup?
Well, I'm sure he's had this before in OTB chess. I think what he's really trying to decide is whether to push B5. And I'm going to echo a point you made in an earlier broadcast in a galaxy far, far away. If you play B5 prematurely and the bishop drops back, White has this idea of pushing A2, A4 and carving out a very nice C4 square for his knight. So you actually see Magnus delaying the move B5, and you might even see him playing the more modest B6.
Right. B5 is an idea for Black, and that's why White plays A4 to stop it, but it gives up a key square. So let's see what Hikaru Nakamura has in mind. He's also being a bit slow, deliberate here, taking his time, longest time control. He's used to winning with 5 seconds on the clock. When he starts with 5 minutes, well, that's quite a lot of time. He chooses A4. So what this was an approach. Does he want to give up control of B4? The answer happens to be yes, but he is taking squares away from Black on the queen side.
And it's not enough just to see, I weakened a square. How accessible is that square? It's not that easy for Black to get a knight to B4. And even if he does, it's not the end of the world for White. A knight on B4 looks pretty, but it's not really impacting the course of the game. So I like the decision to prevent B5. I think White's got a tiny pull here. Magnus has to be very careful about the D4, D5 pawn break, which is especially strong if you play B6. Okay, Magnus takes on D4, and we get a new pawn structure.
I think he can play the move knight to e5. The bishop on c8 wants to get out. The move b6 would be a blunder because it gives White the c6 square. So that's why knight e5 with tempo against the bishop. Now bishop d7. And Danya, I feel like these positions can get very dangerous for White. The reason why is that b4 square and the b3 pawn. At some point, if black gets developed and coordinated, the b3 pawn is an approachable target, whereas b7, the bishop needs to get to f3, easier said than done when there's a knight sitting on e5.
You're absolutely right. Objectively, the position is clearly equal. The engine's always going to throw 0.00 in these positions, but I agree completely. White is the only one with a serious target and a seriously weak square. The b4 square can be occupied by a bishop rather than a knight as originally anticipated. And Magnus, you know what he could do here? He could take on f3 and then play bishop c6 to try to open up the b file, but instead he decides to keep all of the pieces on the board with knight g6.
Yeah, because surprisingly, white is the one with less space, and the position is pretty open. So knight g6 keeping more piece on the board is saying that bishop on e2 desperately wants to get to f3, not so fast. Now, if you go knight d4 back, we could see a repetition of moves with knight back to e5, or you read my mind once again, partner, pawn to e5 is available for black. So queen b1, an odd-looking move, Danya. What's the purpose behind it?
Well, it could be to prepare knight c3 to e4, and the purpose of that not only to relieve the pressure a little bit by trading a pair of binder pieces, but white's greatest asset, arguably, is his dark squared bishop sitting pretty on the long diagonal. It's definitely better placed than black's bishop. So knight e4 is an attempt maybe to accentuate your strengths and minimize your weaknesses, but there's a lot of logistical problems with it. Black can take and then throw bishop c6 with tempo. Hikaru instead, where is he going? Is he going to c4? But then he's walking into queen g5.
I think he overlooked the queen sliding across the 5th rank. He plays bishop f3, but this is just the start of white's troubles. The reason why are the squares, the control, and the coordination, the connection between the rooks in a and f8, Danya. The rook can go to d8 right now, and look at the rook on a1. It's boxed in by that queen on b1. So queen b1 had the point of knight e4. It wasn't played, and now we see why it's going to backfire.
Hikaru definitely under pressure. That queen will have to move out of the way to make space for the rook, but where do you move it? Do you go to a2? Well, that looks ugly. If you go to c2, you walk into a pin. If you go to d3, you walk into rook fd8. So white's queen, surprisingly, is feeling mighty uncomfortable on b1, and Magnus could target that b3 pawn with a well-timed queen d5 or queen b4.
Queen d5 looks like the next move for black. So I think white should play the move rook to d1, challenge the d file, because if you can start swapping off pieces, your problems are not as significant. How do you attack b3? You need queens on the board. It's the only piece for black that can attack it. So if you could first trade rooks, then trade queens, you just feel like your problems are not so significant. So rook d1, an excellent choice. And a move for black, I don't know if it's good right now. I was going to say knight to d5. He chooses queen d5. Then I feel like Magnus, when he has the black pieces, he's not necessarily trying to win. He's just trying to play good, solid chess. And if it's a draw, he gets the white piece in the first move advantage next game.
You read my mind. Again, I was literally about to say, is it fair to say, and I don't like to make these general pronouncements, but it does seem like Magnus is playing with an abundance of caution early in the match. He wants to get his feet under him, and he really wants to press with the white pieces as he did in the previous game. I think he judges that he's got the edge on Hikaru's opening repertoire with 1d4. And can Magnus force the rook trade with rook d8 here? Is that the best option? Or is it to play rook c2?
Rook d8 looks like just a simplification, forcing the rooks off. The problem there, though, is that the dark square bishop, white has light square pawns. So does black. So that means if the knights can hop in, maybe white has a chance to win that game. That is not going to happen because it's nowhere near attacking those pawns on the queen side. But at least from a practical perspective, it's only white who would have winning chances at rook d8.
And that's why I'm always worried about these approaches. When you try to go for simplification and you're essentially playing for a draw, you're giving Hikaru exactly what he wants. Maybe a tiny, tiny pull in the end game, but Hikaru's got to be feeling really the most comfortable he's felt all game, Robert, especially compared to what he had in the middle game. And there he goes, grabbing space with a furious pawn march. He might follow up with g5 and h4.
I love it and hate it at the same time. And the reason why, I like the aggression, the ambition. What I don't like is the overextension, because that pawn on g4 could be a target if you're not looking out for it, especially if you push it to g5. Then your knight is stuck in place on f3 defending that pawn. So I feel like with black's last move, king to f8, king e8 next, that rook is going to be booted from the 7th rank. And then I feel like most of black's problems are behind him. And then it's maybe Magnus who can say, I'm going to play for a win now.
The pendulum continues to swing. I was really under the influence, under the spell of that rook on the 7th, but can you really blame me? Bishop to d8 sends the rook packing. But Magnus is actually not necessarily in a hurry. He might throw in a move like h6 if he wants to stop g5. You could also consider knight e7 to d5 because bishop d8 does compromise the activity of black's bishop, if only temporarily. Knight e7 is on the board.
Knight e7 to d5, going from the king side towards the center. And if g5, knight d5, there might be g takes f6. It looks like white's about to get a new queen, but unfortunately for him, once the king slides off the last rank, that pawn is stopped. But it's close there. You need to be very, very careful, looking out for the tactics.
Let's show that on the analysis board as Hikaru ponders his next move. He's definitely calculating g5, knight d5, g takes f6. You give up the rook on c7. It looks like promotion is unstoppable, but whoop! In comes the rook to the rescue, and white can play something like knight f4, knight h5, Robert, but it's become very clear that white is firmly on the defensive here, and something like knight d5 to f6 knocks the knight out of h5 and picks up the g-pawn. This is not an option. You can play g5, but you definitely can't give up the rook. Back to the live position, where Hikaru is still contemplating his next move.
Yeah, no, this g5 is played, and it's just like what we're talking about. The pawn on g5 is actually quite a strength because the rook can come to h4 if black's not looking out for it, and then h7 falls. But if you retreat the bishop on its diagonal, to say the square e7 or d8, as he just played, if rook h4, you have this move pawn h6, but the reason why you have it is the same exact idea, where the king slides up at the end, and so the passed pawn doesn't become a queen.
I forgot that bishop actually moved away from d8 for a second. Got excited there. Rook h4, h6 is a tactical mechanism. Otherwise, black would lose that corner pawn. But I always get concerned, Robert. Hello, Robin, my new commentator. When you're hanging on the basis of a tactical mechanism like this, because it's very easy to forget about it. And the moment you move the bishop, that rook is flying to h4. Both sides now down under a minute.
Knight b6 played, rook h4 is still met by pawn to h6. It might be a worthy sacrifice at some point.
At this point, yeah.
Magnus, if he just isn't looking out for it, it may hit him and he's going to regret it. But now Hikaru down to 18, 17, 16 seconds, Danya.
He is, and definitely thinking about rook h4, but he's got to make a decision. He drops back to c2, and we are going to get a rook trade.
And look at this. The evaluation is in black's favor. The king can go up to d7, to c6, to c5, to b4, and watch out for that b3 pawn. I was saying with liquidation, it shouldn't be much of an issue, but that black king sprints out very quickly.
And a prophylactic move, trying to prevent the knight from accessing the e5 square. On the other hand, this forces black's king in the opposite direction it wants to go. I think Magnus is saying, hey, knight, why don't you attack the queenside pawns? My king is going to stay in the center to defend the kingside pawns. It looks pretty even, but I think Magnus is the one pushing here.
He is. The king can go e6 to d5. You win king of the hill, but you don't win the game. But at least you have some initiative. The h4 pawn cemented on dark square. If f5 is played, the h4 pawn is loose, but f5 weakens e5. That pawn would be hanging. So that's a king e6, but knight c5 check. You can kick the king back and then play knight d3, so you're not going to have to face f5.
And that's precisely what he's going to do. Hikaru obviously fine with the repetition. And Magnus' strategy has been to play with an abundance of caution in these time scrambles. Is he going to accede to the repetition once again? Hikaru's going to be the one to play.
Wow, knight c4,
my gosh.
kicking the knight from d6. And if you swap knight to c4, b7, a6 are loose. And this is what I was saying.
1 second.
Dark square bishop, and those are light square pawns. The king's coming over, knight takes b7.
Magnus is starting to lose control. Can he trap this knight, though? Hikaru can save it with his pawn. c5 and c6. He drives the pawn and he guts off the king.
Yeah, c6, the king cannot get in there. Bishop b6, he needs to go king e6.
Make a move.
The king can't get to the pawn.
Oh, he's going to flag. He's going to flag.
He lost
he just
time.
did.
And he can't believe it. And look at Hikaru. He's cool as a cucumber. He is focused, and he's acting like nothing just happened, but something huge happened. He gained the lead. It's the first lead in this match, and it belongs to Hikaru Nakamura.
And that final position, I think the reason Magnus flagged is because he recognized that the white king was going to move into the queen side. I think he may have forgotten that the bishop from b6 could attack h4, but it's a moot point now. Magnus panics, and this is a very concerning sign for him in the early going because, Robert, one thing I know for a fact about this match is that we're going to get a heck of a lot of time scrambles.
We're going to get a heck of a lot of time scrambles. We're going to get a heck of a lot of viewers. We are over 125,000 viewers right now. Thank you so much for tuning in. Your day is just getting started. You had the World Cup final. Now you have the Speed Chess Championship final, and it is exciting. Hikaru Nakamura with a 2-1 lead. He's looking to the side like he does, vintage Hikaru, trying to figure out this position. And Magnus with the white side, the Catalan. Danya, I think it's a good opening choice in a blitz match.
And it's a good opening choice after a loss. You're sort of stabilizing. You're playing something on the safer side, something that you're comfortable with. And, man, facing Magnus on the black side of a Catalan, I know of few more appetizing prospects. Maybe facing a penalty kick from Lionel Messi. That's right about comparable.
Yeah, that was not very fun, right? Lionel Messi scoring for Argentina multiple times today, leading them to victory. Congratulations to all of Argentina. But right now we're focused on the chess. And what I'm focused on, Danya, is the activity of white's pieces and the relative passivity of black's. Now, black controls the b4 square, just like in that previous game. That is an important one to keep in mind. And the knight goes to d7, often to go to b6, maybe to d5. When you have less space, you have less control. You want to exchange pieces. If the knight on d7 is exchanged for the knight on c3, that gives black control of the e4 square. And you don't want to see white push e2 to e4. Right now it's covered by both bishop on c6 and knight on f6. But if white could play rook fe1 and pawn e4 in one move, then white would have the advantage.
Great insight and explanation. In these types of Catalan structures, you also sometimes see the light squared bishops get traded, and on paper that favors black. It weakens white's king, and obviously piece exchanges favor the side that's more cramped. But there we go, Robert. That doesn't tell the whole story, because knights are incredibly good at chiseling their way into the opponent's weaknesses, especially in these close positions. And apart from that, I think Magnus is now fully ready to play e4. But will he? Yes, he will. There he goes.
There he goes. He can play f4 as well, just start throwing up all of his kingside pawns. And one thing to note here is this should be reminiscent of the previous game, where there was a dark square bishop that couldn't really make an impact against some knights. Now, that bishop can take the knight on c3, but there's a huge problem. You play bishop c3, white plays pawn takes c3, the b file is open, rook b1, rook b3, rook other to b1, hitting the b7 pawn. So pawn chains are only as strong as their base pawns. The b7 pawn is safe and sound as long as that file remains closed.
And Hikaru bringing his queen into b6 and putting pressure on the pawn on d4. He is going to follow up with rook a to d8. And it concerns me that black's play in this position just seems very easy. It's free-flowing, rook d8. Then perhaps you can bring the knight back to d7 to exchange white's strongest piece. On the other hand, what is Magnus's plan? He doesn't seem remotely capable of pushing d5 here. I don't think that's the way he should go. Maybe he should bring his knight back to f3 and play e5. Robert, do you think he's just going to tread water with some of these improving moves?
For now, he will. And it's often what it requires in this kind of position. Knight f3, you mentioned it. He retreats, he defends. e4 to e5 is something to keep in mind. You don't want to rush that decision.
No.
Because as soon as you play e5, you give the d5 square, and your pawn on d4 is a long-term weakness. That said, you vacate the e4 square for your knight. So what white sometimes does here is pawn h4. After e5, pawn g4, and start an attack on the king side, because look at black's pieces. Bishop on b4, queen on b6, rook on d7. They're playing on the other side of the board, so if you can get a timely attack, you may devastate, obliterate the black king.
A lot of players, a lot of fans, they think of these positions as boring, but they're not. It's a slow burn for sure, right? Nothing happens fast in these types of positions, not even the moves played by the players themselves, but there's so much going on behind the surface. There's so much tension on the board. Look at the pressure the black exerts on d4. Look at the potential that white has on the king side. Something's going to happen here, and it's only a matter of time. But I'm on the same page. You should not play e5 until careful consideration, because as a very wise man once said, pawn chains are only as strong as their base pawn.
Certainly the case. The knight on f3 doing a good job of defending d4, but as soon as that pawn goes up to e5, black will try to strike with c6 to c5 at the right moment, undermining the center. So queen c2. Let's keep everything defended. But where to next, Donnie? Is queen b3 an option? I mean, where is that queen going?
I have no answer for you. Queen b3, where is it going from there? And a big decision by Hikaru as he takes on c3 and immediately follows up with a center strike. Help me make sense of this.
I mean, I like the b5 square for white now. He goes knight to e5, then knight can go to c4, take control of the light squares. But if the knight goes to c4, black has queen c6, putting pressure on the e4 pawn. So maybe white needs to play for f3 at some point, but for the moment, the d4 pawn is loose. Look at all the pressure Hikaru's pieces are exerting on white's center.
The knight's attacking e4, the queen's attacking d4. Knight c4 is played. What is Magnus planning on queen c6? I think it is your move f3, and it may seem to blunder due to c takes d4, but remember, after white recaptures, the knight on c4 is then defended. Hikaru goes the other way, queen to a6, chasing the knight away, but it re-centralizes to e3, and I think the trend of the game is, by a slight margin, starting to favor Magnus here.
And I thought he was going knight a3 to b5. Like that b5 square was an outpost for his knight. Instead, he centralized. You can't really blame somebody for keeping their pieces in the center of the board, but that b5 square was juicy because it also defended the d4 pawn. So knight e3, and we're past that point for now. And as I look at this position, Danya, I'm thinking Do I start pushing my pawns? Is e5 on the agenda? I don't love it because it allows the black knight to slide into d5 again, but I'm just trying to figure out what Magnus has in store for Hikaru after Hikaru starts trading pawns.
Well, if it was Magnus's move on the previous position, he would have played d5 and then cemented that pawn with c4. I think that's a big reason why Hikaru has traded on d4. Now, the move d5, it's still possible. It may still happen, but it loses a lot of its luster because after the exchange, that passed pawn, it's all alone, and passed pawns in the middle game can be a serious liability.
It's true, though. That knight would love to jump to f5 eventually. So if you do trade off the pawn on e6, you get clearance for the knight to land on f5. That's something to keep in the back of our minds. But Danya, right now, Hikaru done a full minute on the clock. I was about to say it. Once again, partner, you're reading my mind. Can Hikaru strike with b5? Because right now that pawn is a backwards pawn. And if you play rook b1, you stop that pawn in its tracks. Now, Hikaru is saying, I've defended b7. I'm going to go after the d file. And he does just that. But Magnus claiming that he's safe and sound pushing for a passed pawn.
Well, he's going to have to reinforce this pawn because Hikaru is actually threatening. I'm busy counting the attackers and defenders, but I think he is threatening to capture 4 or 5, however many times on d5. And see, the problem for the last couple moves for Magnus has been that the queen is kind of pegged to the e4 pawn. If you carelessly play queen b3, that move may actually work out tactically because after knight takes e4, there's d takes e6 and maybe e takes f7 check, but that has to be carefully calculated by Carlsen, and he slides his queen instead back toward b1 using the back rank to defend the pawn indirectly. What a move. And stops b5.
It's defense by attack. The h7 square is covered. So if we swap everything on d5...
I'll show this.
Let's show it because it's very instructive. The white rook lands on the c8 square with not just check, but checkmate because the h7 square is covered by that white queen. That would be mate. That's why Hikaru, he took on d5 once, but he is not going to keep capturing.
Back to the live board we go. He has indeed taken on d5. Magnus not rushing to recapture. I would have assumed that he could pre-move e takes d5. Maybe he's thinking about starting with knight takes d5, weighing the pros and cons of keeping the knights on the board versus taking them off the board. And because of the prospect of knight f5, he decides to keep them on the board. But Robert, now knight takes d5, that threat has been renewed.
It has been, but the dark squares are compromised. So if this queen slides up to b2 at some point, watch out because it does right now slicing across the board. The same back rank problem exists. If you take on d5, we swap everything. Rook c8, and as you're pointing out, rook or queen to h8 will be checkmate. Look at the queen on b2. It covers the entire length of the diagonal. This spells trouble for Hikaru, who simply slides his rook up at Danya. Maybe white can do the same, bringing the rook up on the d file.
He can, and you mentioned it, a slightly different defensive mechanism, but the same result. The pawn on d5 was untouchable, and Magnus continuing to tighten the screws. This is where he is best, as he tightens the noose from all sides. The rook moves up to c5. It can slide over to b5, and this is right around where Hikaru seriously regretting not pushing b5 when he had a chance.
And you said all sides. I'm also looking at the clock. That may not be on the board, but it's definitely on Hikaru's mind. 22 seconds to over a minute. He goes queen a7, attacking the rook. The rook can simply slide over to b5. White can also make the move queen to c3, but you have to watch out because there's knight e4 with a fork. So watch out for these jumpy knights. You do not want to blunder here if you're Magnus Carlsen.
And queen a7 is a classic Hikaru move. This is what he does. He poses problems. He forces you to make decisions. And before you know it, he's dragged you into another time scramble. Rook to d to c1 by Magnus, the eval bar disapproving. b6, and Hikaru's going to go after the pawn with queen a8, but rook c6. I was expecting rook c7.
Okay, so knight d5, rook takes d6, knight takes e3 is check intermezzo, but
there's queen a8.
Back rank problem. He goes queen a8. Wow, what a move, because if rook d6, d5 will fall.
Oh my goodness, and if it falls, white can end up a pawn down.
Maybe queen takes f6 here is a good practical try. But you give up your queen for a rook and a knight after queen takes f6. I'm just thinking about this because the b6 pawn is also loose.
And Robert, another detail. Queen e5, knight takes d5. Seems to blunder a rook, but knight takes e3 is a double check against white's king, and white's the one who gets mated. And look at this. Look at this. Magnus down to 15 seconds. We've got another time scramble, and Hikaru is once again in his comfort zone.
Yeah, Max needs to move. He's still thinking. He could sack the queen. He could take b6, but d5 will fall if he doesn't move that knight off the board. So the pawn is gone. The rook is protected on c6.
Rook
but that king is in
perpetual
trouble. He goes h4 instead. He wants to win.
He wants to win, but he's down to 4 seconds. We've seen this story unfold before. It's an equal position objectively, but both sides making threats. Magnus down to 1 second.
The rook can't move from d5. The f7 pawn is loose. The queen hits the rook. Queen lines up with rook on f7. Watch out. The second rook for white can come into the game.
It can come in the game through c4. There goes black's rook. Hikaru offering a queen trade, and that's basically a peace offering by Nakamura.
Well, white and black both have one active and one passive rook, but white's passive rook on f4 is still more active. There's nothing to attack. The player shuffle. Hikaru gets a draw. Magnus shakes his head. It is still a 1-point lead for Nakamura, and we're just about halfway through this time control.
We've had 3 draws and 3 of the most exciting games I've ever seen. All of these draws have been so combative, so professional, so interesting, so full of detail. And Hikaru with yet another incredible defensive effort, Robert.
And look at Hikaru. He's surprised by Magnus.
Whoa!
E5. And look, Hikaru.
Was that a mouse slip?
I don't think so.
Gotta be a mouse. It's like a souped-up Budapest gambit with a bishop already fianchettoed.
Also,
Hikaru's like, I'm the one who plays these lines.
I thought he was drinking a beer. That looked like he had a nice little pint there. But either way, Hikaru is shaking his head because this is a weird position. Knight g4 attacks the pawn on e5. Even if you play bishop g2, the knight can still capture on e5 because the knight on f3 will be pinned to the bishop on g2 behind it. So this is what Magnus is aiming for. At first,
speaking of beer,
I thought he's tilted.
Magnus were drinking something that's dark in color. And, man, both of these players having a good time.
I think it's just wake-up juice. That's what he's looking for. And what is going on here? Knight takes e5?
He's allowed it, and I think he's basically just saying playing positionally. He just says, I'm slightly better in the resulting position because I've got a pawn in the center and you don't.
That is pretty good reasoning. I stand behind that. And now we see some trades, but black is not really much worse here. You play d6, you play a5, you get your knight out. You start with a5. But the point is that black is very solid. Where are the weaknesses? There are none to point out. Now, the one thing that I'd watch out for is if white plays queen c2 here and gets clever, look out for knight g5. It loses a piece on g5, but you gain the bishop on b7. So it's easy to forget about tactics like that.
It most certainly is. LPDO goes
C5.
Loose pieces drop off. C5 looks
C5.
so strong here, crunching through the center and forcing weaknesses in black structure. Another miss by Magnus. And of course, the idea is BC Rook C5, exasperation on the face of Magnus as he hands Hikaru another incredibly pleasant position out of the open.
And look at Hikaru side-eyeing Magnus. He's like, what are you doing? Like he
Really,
noticed
Magnus?
that he
E5?
has C5. and Magnus also is like, what am I doing? They're both asking the same question, but there's a big problem for black. This A4 pawn, it wasn't A5 and about to be captured. Now it's an A4, but it's a long-term weakness. You have to keep your rook defending it, maybe to bring another piece to the defense as well. I just feel like things are going wrong for Magnus as of this stage of the match.
Definitely. Hikaru's up a point. He's in control. He's in control in this game. But to take the devil's advocate side, it's really not the end of the world for black. Black has this pawn chain. It's relatively well defended. What's funny is that Hikaru doesn't actually have to move the rook away from c5 just yet. He can make a calm move like a3. Now, he does move the rook, but not because he has to, because he wanted to. He's attacking a4. He could try to bring the queen up to b4. A lot of energy among white's pieces here, and Magnus has to figure out a way to get this knight into the game. Maybe just knight d7 is the way to do it.
And the good news for Magnus is if he can successfully get his knight to c5, it's kind of like an outpost because white can't play b2 to b4 because of en passant. The a pawn will capture. A knight on c5 defends that pawn on a4. It stares the e4 square in the center. So that's what Magnus needs to go for. But as you were indicating, there might be some pressure against the black king. That's a rook lift on c4. It could swing all the way over to h4. So be very, very careful if you're Magnus because your king may find itself the victim of an attack.
And there's another devilish idea that I think Hikaru has cooked up. Let's bring him an analysis board real fast. Knight d7. I think his idea is queen d2 to c2. And you might say, well, that walks right into knight c5. It defends everything. Look at that rook on d1. There's an x-ray going on, and rook takes c5 wins material. You win a queen and a piece for 2 rooks. And then you top it off with knight g5, the idea you mentioned earlier. This is out of the question. And if knight c5 isn't possible, then how, Hikaru might politely ask, are you defending the a4 and c7 pawns at the same time? I think black has ways to tactically defend them. Maybe rook takes c2 against rook c7. But Robert, all of that has to be calculated and planned out very carefully. When you're down a point, you don't want to walk the tightrope. You want a nice, solid game.
Yeah, and there's bishop a6 ideas for black as well. At some point, bishop a6 hits the rook on c4 and the pawn on e2. But right now, I think black is just a little bit too loose to play that move because the a4 pawn is that important. But you know that Magnus is calculating bishop a6 with rook e2 to follow.
Bishop a6, it does open up the diagonal. It's a very tactical move. And my guess is that Hikaru, it's not necessarily that he missed bishop a6. I just think he intuitively believes in the power of his pieces. He believes that he's going to find something in that position. And you can just tell both players are hard at work calculating bishop b7 to a6. And maybe a3 is worth throwing in for black as well. Just a thought.
And that pineapple is hard at work. Look at it glowing in the background behind Hikaru, right? That is his streamer setup when he is not in California, and he is focused. Look at him. He's looking at this board. He thinks that Magnus is going wrong here. And Magnus, the look on his face is one of disgust. And he does develop the knight to d7. So, Danya, queen c2, double attack. There must be something that Magnus has, and a3 is played, but apparently not great.
And this is what he has been cooking up for the last minute and a half. Or he actually spent 2 minutes and 25 seconds on the move knight d7. And it wasn't that move he was busy finding. It was the move a3. What's going on here, Robert? There's so many hanging pawns. Rook takes c7 comes to mind. I think he wants something like bishop e4. And he wants to use the contact the black queen is making with the white rook to be able to play a takes b2. So I think Hikaru's first order of business has to be to address this a3 pawn. Am I on the right track here? Is knight g5 possible? What's happening, Robert?
So many questions. And I think that if you go b3, a very calm move, just avoiding the pawn trade, there could be a move rook a7. So he goes knight g5, hitting the h7 pawn. The queen has to take the knight. The bishop takes the bishop on b7. And after black is rook a to b8, saving the rook and attacking the bishop, the c7 pawn falls. White goes up a pawn. It looks like a healthy extra pawn. So unless Magnus can drum up some counterplay, he is simply worse.
And he doesn't have much time to drum it up. Rook takes d7 here. There's the move queen g5 to b5, forking the rook and the bishop. Magnus saw that from a mile away. Unbelievable calculation by both players. And talk about walking the tightrope. You're automatically walking the tightrope when you're letting a pawn live on b2 like this.
That was impressive. I mean, Magnus sees rook d7, queen b5, and the bishop can move up to c6. But then black gets a second queen. The rook, the queen, and the pawn all in the same line. You get to promote. You win the game in short order. So right now, it's a big moment for Hikaru. You want to play queen takes b2. Give me that pawn, but you walk into a pin. So there could be a knight c5 shot, putting pressure on the pin piece. White is well defended for the moment, but Danya, it looks scary even if white remains better.
That was satisfying, putting pressure on a pin piece. That was quite a bit of alliteration. Hikaru says, I don't care about that pin. I'm just taking all of your pawns. Look at that. Rook takes d6, laughing in the face of danger. And what Hikaru's saying is, hey, look, yeah, my bishop's under pressure, but how are you going to put more pressure on it? I've got two defenders. That's all I need. I could slide my rook to b6 if necessary. And Robert, Magnus might be running out of ideas here, and he is down 2 pawns. Let's not forget that.
He's down 2 pawns. His knight doesn't have any outposts anymore. The pawn on d6 was captured. That was an important piece protecting the knight on c5. So where is that knight going? You need to get some counterplay, some threats. I feel like he might be close to lost already.
Yeah, and the eval bar is bearing that out. I'm looking at rook e7, try to get this rook off. But then black is experiencing problems with his back rank. There's rook c8 check. It's not that there's options and they're complicated. I don't think Magnus is a single move here. He might have to just take twice on b7 and try to win one of white's pawns back, but even that's easier said than done.
Well, if he could trade on b7 and win the a2 pawn, if we just toss that pawn off the board, that does give black pretty good chances to survive. Because a rook and 4 against a rook and 3, that's white with a rook and the 4 pawns from e2 to h2, and black having a rook and 3 pawns, that is a theoretical draw. It's not easy. Jeroen Piquet beat Garry Kasparov in that exact endgame. So if Garry Kasparov can lose, then anybody in the opponent can lose. But that said, that is the aim for Magnus Carlsen, and he's down to 20 seconds.
20 seconds.
I feel like he is a bit aimless.
He definitely is, and Hikaru doesn't even need 2 extra pawns to win when the opponent has 20 seconds on the clock. He drops the knight back to e6. I like that from a practical standpoint. I think Magnus's only real source of counterplay is going to be that knight hopping around. It can hop into f4 using the pin. So Hikaru's not out of the woods, and he doesn't think he's out of the woods. He drops the rook back to c4. And look at the attention to detail, Robert, in Hikaru's play. What does that move do? It stops knight f4. That's why he put it on c4, and he can move it to b4 to finally unpin the bishop. And then he's free to roam about the cabin.
Although rook b4, there could be like queen c5, just keeping the pin alive. He goes rook b6, queen a5, queen e1 check is kind of a threat. Doesn't lead to anything significant just yet, but the e2 pawn may collapse. Be very careful. I see a tactic, actually. If black can move queen e1, king g2, knight f4 check, giving up the knight, taking on e2, things like that,
great
it looks a bit worrisome.
And Hikaru sending the queen to e1. I think after knight f4 check, the rook takes on f4. I know you were talking more hypothetically, but what's not hypothetical is that Magnus has 5 seconds on his clock. His counterplay is getting just brutally extinguished, and Hikaru just a couple more accurate moves away from solidifying his material advantage and winning this game. Is he going to move his bishop? Is this the time to move it to d5 or c6?
I think seems like a great time. Bishop d5 looks very good. There may be a swap on b5 because there is no knight c7. The rook on e8 is loose in all these positions.
Oh,
look at this clinical technique. But Magnus desperately wants that d4 square, and Hikaru doesn't play e3 and allows the knight in.
And the reason he played e4 was in order to meet rook takes b5 with a takes b5. This is a passer, and he's going to push it. And Magnus has no choice but to get a pair of rooks off the board, stopping knight d4. Hikaru eliminating every sliver of counterplay that Magnus is coming up with here.
This is brilliant play from Hikaru Nakamura. He could have played rook b8, but then a4 would have dropped, and Hikaru does not want to give up that pawn. Just
now he can
progress
push
move by move. And then knight d4 though,
and meet queen b6.
Trying to trade the queens. Good call by you.
Keep pushing, or rook a4, get behind the pawn. Magnus has literally 2 moves to drum something up because that pawn is reaching a8 in a tizzy, and Magnus flags. It's over.
And now Magnus is in green, and he wants to win that green by taking down Hikaru Nakamura in this final.
That's hilarious. It reminds me of those, those psychology studies where they show that you're actually not attentive to change at all. I'm impressed you noticed that, but I was like, green? Magnus Carlsen? We definitely didn't see that before. Am I crazy? We have seen Berlins before in the chess career of Hikaru Nakamura, haven't we?
We certainly have. We see a4 played by Magnus, and Hikaru looks to the side. He's like, what is Magnus aiming for? What is my preparation? And let's not confuse the matter. Both of these players prepare. And maybe they don't prepare it right before the match for this specific game, but they are so well prepared throughout their careers that when Magnus plays some sideline, Hikaru says, yeah, I've seen this one before.
They're locked and they're loaded and they review their lines constantly. And this move A to A4, it might strike you as puzzling. It was the recommendation of opening specialist Grandmaster Darius Schwirch in a recent book that he wrote on the Ruy Lopez. This is what he recommended against the Berlin. And the idea is to keep this bishop on B5 for the time being. Now, eventually, it often slides back to F1 anyway, and then the pawn advances to A5, just kind of clamping down on the queen side. But look at this. Look at this from Magnus. He goes D4, sacrificing the pawn. And Hikaru says, no, I want the Berlin. I want the structure.
He gives the pawn back on E4, and that's what great players do. They don't get materialistic. They say, I will give you that pawn back, but I will get time and activity. He played D5 with tempo against the rook on E4. The rook slides back. Now the light square bishop can get out from C8 and go to G4 as you're indicating. So one big thing that Magnus and Hikaru need to figure out is bishop takes C6 a threat.
You're reading my mind. It's
black
crazy.
Pawn structure, and the knight is trying to come into E5 to follow. So bishop G4 at least eliminates the knight E5 follow-up, and that's why Hikaru played bishop G4 with the pin.
And Magnus delaying for the time being. He procrastinates on the decision, but he improves his position nonetheless. The move C3 is necessary. It takes the sting out of bishop takes F3. Will he take on C6 now? Something tells me he'd rather keep his bishop on the board, but who knows?
He can also play the move A5 right now, and there's a reason why. If black responds to A5 with the pawn push A6, now it is time to take on C6. So if we can actually bring up an analysis board and show that, I think it's very instructive that what white wants to accomplish in inducing the move A6 is to get a clamp on the dark squares. B4, no C5 pawn push for you. And once you establish this control of the dark squares, yes, right now the eval bar says that black is better, but in the long term, black is stuck with these pawn weaknesses in place.
You're absolutely right. I think this is a great line, and this shows that there is a lot at stake here. Well, there's $20,000 at stake and an SEC title, but in this particular position, what's at stake is the future of black's queen side. This is an idea Hikaru has to take seriously, and after A5, he might decide to drop the knight back to E7. Maybe this is part of the reason he put his bishop on D6. But first, Magnus takes a rain check on that and asks politely, or not so politely, whether Hikaru wants to stay on this diagonal. And I think he does.
Well, if he wants to play bishop h5, he has to be ready for the move g2 to g4. We often tell our students, don't push pawns in front of your king. It makes your king weaker, less safe, but sometimes you want to break a pin. It's that important. So g4 is a possibility in some positions with knight e5 galloping into the center. So right now, Hikaru plays bishop f5. He drops it back. Knight e5 still a possibility here for Magnus.
It is indeed, as is bishop b5 to d3 if you really want to bail out. But if you want to fight for the advantage here, I think you need to introduce some form of imbalance, Robert. I don't think you're beating Hikaru with a pawn structure as it currently stands. Bishop takes c6 and knight e5 looks pretty tempting, and it's funny that Hikaru is actually provoking this. I think he's doing that consciously. I think he senses that Magnus isn't quite as comfortable as he normally is taking these kinds of positional risks, and he's inviting it and taking the Hess approach. Is there knight a5 and c6, though?
Wow, that's a big tactical shot. And if it's available, that would be huge for Hikaru. And he's going to look at it. I mean, he's looking quizzically at the board. He plays a6.
He missed
that's
it.
A big opportunity for Magnus. Hikaru doesn't see that little tactical shot here. And now, Danya, bishop c6 and pawn b4, it looks like you get the clamp that's desired on the queen side.
That was a fantastic call, and you get an even better version of it because the knight is now free to jump into e5 when necessary, supplementing the potential move queen a4. And that pawn on c6 is going to be under fire from all angles.
Right. And so Magnus hasn't moved yet. He might play your bishop d3, just try to gain space on the queen side first, then trade bishops. But I like bishop takes c6 with knight e5 or b4 first. The point is that you are just getting the activity that you desire. There is no pin on that knight any longer.
And correct me if I'm wrong, it doesn't seem like bishop takes c6 is that much of a risk. Yes, you're giving up the bishop pair. Yes, in the future, you might have to consider some sacks on h3 and you have to watch for the safety of your king. But it's not like bishop takes c6 burns any bridges, and Magnus doesn't want to burn any bridges at all. Is he playing a little bit too conservatively? Not to criticize the world champion, of course, but I think you kind of get what I'm saying here, Robert.
Of course I get what you're saying. I think that he is just a little bit sloppy in the early stages. He'd be the first to say that. That's not undue criticism. And for Hikaru, when he's been making mistakes, it feels like they're not as consequential. I mean, that game where Magnus won a pawn, he had some great chances, but he just couldn't make the most of it. And Hikaru, on the other hand, he won a game on time. That was big. It was a must. And then he won another game by stealing a couple pawns and converting it with precision. So queen d7. Is bishop takes h3 a threat? Magnus didn't want to find out, so he takes plays knight h4, and he's going to play queen g4 and try to get that knight into f5.
And this is the kind of chess that we are accustomed to see from Magnus Carlsen, tightening the screws, playing on both sides of the board, and he moves the queen up, not to g4, but one square behind on f3. You're not threatening queen takes d5. Don't blunder bishop h2. But what you are threatening is knight h4 to f5, and that is why Hikaru engineers pressure on the e-file to distract White's attention away from the f5 square and force White to address the subtle threat, Robert, of rook takes e1 checkmate.
Well, a5 is a weakness. That's a big point here. Bishop d2, rook takes e1. You'd love to take back with your rook on e1, get the open file, but a5 falls. You cannot afford to lose that pawn because not only is it a pawn, but the knight will sink its teeth into those light squares on the queen side. So big choice for Magnus. He played bishop e3, blocking the rook's access in the e-file, but you're also blocking your own rook on e1, and that just doesn't feel very pleasant. The black rook can slide up to e4, and suddenly it's Hikaru who has all the fun in the position.
Well, you like to observe when offense changes into defense, and I think we're seeing, and vice versa, we're seeing that here. Magnus drove that pawn up to a5. It was unequivocally a strength. You were grabbing space on the queen side. All of a sudden, it's turned into perhaps White's biggest weakness, and I think we are going to see Hikaru taking on e1. And is Magnus going to recapture with the bishop here? No, he's going to sack the pawn.
Wow.
And I think he's going to make a serious play for quick kingside attack based on knight h4 to f5.
And Hikaru is like, ooh, I didn't necessarily take this as seriously as I could have, because he thought knight takes a5 was a pawn, but knight f5 and queen g4 is the big threat there. Some people may think you're just trying to take this bishop on d6. No. You're threatening checkmate on g7 and a discovery. When pieces are on the same line as each other, in this case, a queen on g4 and a queen on d7, you have to think what happens when the piece in between gets out the way. So g6 play to stop knight f5. Magnus can play pawn to b4 here, Danya. That's available. And he just says, I've gained all the space on the queen side, and now I don't have to worry about losing that pawn.
And another wise decision by Hikaru that's easy to gloss over. He says, I'm avoiding knight takes a5 with a 10-foot pull. But not only that, he didn't take 90 seconds to make that decision. He keeps his edge on the clock. You're surprised by the move g3.
Well, d5 is now can be captured. Before it could not because the bishop h2 check with a discovery. So h3 can be captured, a5 can be captured, but no matter which pawn black takes, everything can be captured, but d5 will fall. That's such an important pawn in black's position. It frees up the rest of the white pieces. So a big move there from Magnus, good recognition, and Hikaru needs to find a move. Does he just defend the pawn on d5 with knight to e7? But that allows the bishop from d2 to go into h6, the queen to go to f6, and watch out for checkmate.
And that's because the move g6, it wasn't all peaches and cream. Yes, you stop knight f5. You stop one thing, you close some doors, you open others. And after bishop h6 and queen f6, the door to the 2-point lead is going to be closed for Hikaru. So he's got to do something about this, and he's got to defend d5 at the same time. He's got a lot on his to-do list here, Robert. Maybe bishop back to e7 should be considered, but that is a little bit passive, and I think Hikaru's hesitating to basically hand the initiative over to Carlsen. There's also this knight maneuver to f4. So just because you defend the pawn once doesn't mean you're going to keep it alive forever.
And one thing about b4, which has finally been played, is if the queens are off the board, black will play b6. And if we get a swap on b6, black gets an outside pass pawn. So keep that in mind, that a queen trade could be very, very bad for white with rooks and pieces on the board. So right now, Magnus has no interest in trading queens. How Hikaru does that is a great question. And your idea, knight h4 to g2 to f4, that goes right after the d5 pawn, centralize the knight, and then I can use the h pawn as a battering ram.
Hikaru's shaking his head. He knows that these are exactly the kinds of positions that we are accustomed to see Magnus winning well over 50% of the time. We're also accustomed to see Hikaru defending them well over 50% of the time. Who's going to prevail as Magnus continues to tighten the screws, but Hikaru defends with c6, and that's a big move because finally the pressure has been taken off the pawn, and Hikaru can focus on protecting his king side.
There's the move queen f6 here threatens rook takes e7, but I think black doesn't have rook because queen e5. You just get a pin everywhere. But Magnus making Magnus moves. King g2, small
and Hikaru,
incremental progress, but Hikaru's jumping in.
He's making Hikaru moves, and he's also forcing Magnus to make a move. Who's down to 17 seconds, reshuffling, rerouting. But here comes Hikaru's knight, sinking its teeth into e4. I think Hikaru's getting the upper hand here.
Well, now he allowed knight e5 with tempo, so he didn't bring the knight to e4. And wow, he trades rooks.
Now he's going to go knight e4. No, he's just going to trade everything. Queen e4 here forces the queen trade.
That's bad news for Magnus, who's in time trouble. If he takes the queen, knight takes back, and the c3 pawn is loose.
Oh, my goodness.
Queen. Oh, gosh. I thought he's hung a piece, but the knight is under attack.
Knight e8 almost wins the game. White has to cling to the bishop. Hikaru down to 8 seconds. He's played it. Where's the queen going? Back to f4?
Wow, goes back to f4. Bishop h6, trade, and then bring the knight in. He wants a repetition.
I don't think he minds a repetition. He's up 2 points in the match. No need to do anything crazy. But we know Hikaru. He's thinking about it.
Yeah, 3 seconds. I think he just repeats. He makes the draw. Hikaru, he keeps his 2-point lead. That is good match management by Hikaru Nakamura. Remember, we see the eval bar go up and down. The players have no idea. And that looked like an equal position. The same amount of material for both sides. So now we're in game 7. It's 4-2 Hikaru. Are we going to see a King's Indian from Magnus?
We might, and we saw King's Indian earlier from Hikaru. Magnus saying, give me some of that. And will Hikaru play bishop d3? Oh my gosh, he does! We have the same position with colors reversed. A little match strategy, a little verve from Hikaru Nakamura, and smiles by only one player. Magnus is not amused.
And just like the recent movie, that smile is not pleasant. That is going to haunt Magnus Carlsen because bishop d3 induces bishop g4, looks very logical, and then the bishop would have gone back to e2. So he says, anything you can do, I can do better. And he just says, let's go, Magnus. You're going to have to come up with something new.
And another perk of putting the bishop on d3 is that it can slide back to c2. And later on, once the knight appears on c5, as it frequently does in the King's Indian, the pressure on e4 often forces white to contort himself. With the bishop nicely sitting on c2, white can just keep going about his business. And this move h3, we saw Carlsen play g4. Hikaru says 2 can play at that game.
They certainly can. And for Magnus, he has to figure out which strike he wants, e5 or c5. He chooses neither. He plays a5. He wants to gain space on the queen side and not allow a bayonet-style attack with pawn to b4. So I think that Magnus is kind of playing this like dodgy chess. He's just sort of avoiding the tension. He's just making Hikaru figure out things. But the issue for Magnus is usually that works. Except in this match, Hikaru has figured everything out pretty much to perfection.
He most certainly has. And I think this opening choice by Magnus, it signifies that he is ready to take on more risk. He wants to wipe this 2-point lead out going into the 3+1 portion. He knows how confident Hikaru is in that notorious Title Tuesday time control. And Magnus doesn't want to let this lead persist, because every game you play when you're down by 2, you might go down by 3. And Hikaru is not known to give away big leads in the SEC.
No, and you and I both majored in history in college, and well, history for Magnus does not want to repeat itself. One time control was against Maxime Vacher-Lagrave in 2020, 7 Perry each 4 to F5. The reason why that's